an Islamia media production.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. No history book chronicling the exploits of great leaders and conquerors is complete without the exploits of Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or as he is known in the West, Saladin. Hailed by friend and foe alike as one of history's most dynamic, trustworthy and merciful leaders, Saladin was the very epitome of the noble Islamic ruler, who earned a position of dignity and honor even in the hearts of his enemies. Monarch, warrior, liberator of Islam's third holiest mosque, a Muslim legend.
Narrated by Gai Eton.
The Crusades.
France, the year 1095 of the Christian era. After the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban delivers a speech to the gathered knights, laymen and clergy, imploring them to march to Jerusalem, where, according to Christian beliefs, lay the tomb of Christ, the Holy Sepulchre, and protect it from Muslim Turks who had advanced to the very doorstep of the Byzantine Empire. The Pope's speech spread throughout Christendom and inspired common men, women, and even children to take the cross, a religious ritual which many would vow service to Christ, and to take up arms against the Muslims, the occupants of the Holy Land, for over 400 years. Pope Urban himself embarked upon a year-long tour throughout central and southern France, where he preached that the liberation of Jerusalem would guarantee salvation and a place in heaven for the participants. This message was delivered at a time when people of all walks of life believed deeply in God, heaven and hell, so the Pope's speech struck a chord in the hearts of those who heard it.
A great commotion arose through all regions of France. Anyone who earnestly wished to follow God with pure heart and mind hastened to the road of the Holy Sepulchre. The Lord Pope said, "Brothers, you will have to suffer many things in the name of Christ. Wretchedness, poverty, nakedness, persecution, and many other things of this kind. Just as the Lord said to his disciples, you must suffer many things in my name." Gesta Francorum.
Though fired with a religious zeal, this first crusade, known as the People's Crusade, was ill-equipped, underfunded, and officially unapproved. Eminent leaders of this first crusade soon emerged, such as Peter the Hermit, a charismatic monk who called hundreds of common people in a growing entourage. This ragtag People's Crusade came from northern France, the Rhineland and Saxony. Many people simply threw down their work tools and joined in the march. They longed to confront those whom they considered to be their enemies, and in late 1098 they did. However, these were not Muslims, but Jews.
A massacre of Jews was first carried out in the city of Cologne by its citizens. Without warning, they attacked a small band of Jews, they decapitated many, and inflicted serious wounds. They destroyed their homes and synagogues and divided a very great sum of looted money amongst themselves. Lord Emmerich.
When the Crusaders encountered the Jewish communities of northern France and later Germany, they felt justified in attacking them, as they considered them to be the killers of Christ. Thousands of Jews were slaughtered by renegade followers of Peter the Hermit, who were ignorant of the fact that Jews were looked upon as an economic asset in that area and were permitted to own land and run their own business. Whole Jewish communities were nonetheless victims of a pogrom that has since echoed through history. The People's Crusade was fast cultivating a reputation for barbarity, savagery, and fanaticism. After many such bloody episodes of looting, pillaging, and even acts of cannibalism, the People's Crusade finally reached Anatolia, where their wanton rampage was stopped by the Muslim ruler Kilij Arslan, who ruled over a largely Christian population. So ended the People's Crusade. Within a few years, a second crusade was launched, but this time led by knights, barons, and kings. Finally, after capturing Nicaea, Dorylaeum, crossing the mountain range of the Antitaurus, taking Edessa and Antioch, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. The year was 1099. History records that in 638 of the Christian era, 400 years before, the famous Muslim Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, captured Jerusalem, whereupon he reassured his patriarch that Christian lives and property would be respected and protected by Muslims. Unfortunately, the Crusaders, who now stormed the walls of Jerusalem, had none of the honorable intentions entertained by Omar. The historian chronicler Fulcher of Chartres wrote,
"With drawn swords our men ran through the streets, not sparing anyone, even those begging for mercy."
The taking of Jerusalem marked one of the grimmest episodes in the history of the Crusades. Not even those who sought refuge in Al-Aqsa Mosque were spared. The Gesta Francorum writes,
"All dead Muslims had to be cast out on account of the terrible stench, because nearly the whole city was crammed with their dead bodies. The Muslims who were still alive dragged the dead out of the city and in front of 3 gates made huge piles of them, as big as houses. Such a slaughter of Muslims no one had ever seen or heard of."
After 461 years of peaceful coexistence, Jerusalem fell into the bloody hands of these marauders from the west. In all the years of Muslim rule, Jerusalem contained a substantial Christian minority, but the conquering Crusaders had no tolerance for any other faith but their own. Thousands of Muslims were mercilessly slaughtered as the Crusaders swept through the city with a savage bloodlust. The land would remain in their hands for the next 89 years, during which time they fought many battles, not only with the surrounding inhabitants, but amongst themselves. The unsuspected Muslim world had long established itself from as far as China to Spain in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Antioch, while European cities still struggled with their own barbarity. Islamic cities, in contrast, were some of the largest in the world and flourished as centers of trade and commerce. They excelled in many sciences, including astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. When refugees fleeing from the Crusaders' onslaught reached Damascus, the news spread of the Christian capture of Jerusalem. But the Damascenes did not realize the enormity of the problem, that the conquest of Jerusalem was a clash and imposition of one civilization over another.
How can the eye sleep between the lids at a time of disasters that would awaken any sleeper, while your Syrian brothers can only sleep on the backs of their horses or in the belly of vultures? Poet Al-Muzaffar Al-Abiwardi.
It took some time for most to fully understand its implications, but soon a steady call for jihad could be heard from the pulpits during the Friday congregational prayers. What was needed was a concerted response to the invasion, a unified Muslim response. However, at that time, there was no such thing as a united Islamic world. The Muslim world was divided under two major dynasties, the Sunni Abbasids and the Shiite Fatimids in North Africa, and principalities dotted here and there, not to mention small cults such as the Assassins.
I see you people slow to raise the lance against the enemy. I see faith resting on feeble pillars. Poet Al-Muzaffar Al-Abiwardi.
It would take a champion of great skill and ability to mount a united response to the Crusaders, who would not give up so easily what they had fought for. A champion who would match their ferocity and religious zeal with courage, fearlessness, and compassion.
Rise to power.
Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, who was to be known to the world as Saladin, was born in 1138 of the Christian era and was of Kurdish descent. His father, Ayyub, was an honorable and generous man who raised his son with the same valued ideals.
The Prophet is reported to have said, Allah loves courage. Salahuddin was indeed one of the most courageous of men, brave, gallant, firm, and intrepid in any circumstance. Bahadin ibn Shaddad, Salahuddin's biographer.
Saladin's education and military training was in the cultivated surroundings of Turkish courts in Syria. His incredible rise to power began when the pious Sultan Nur-ud-Din, who resided in Damascus, wished to reclaim Egypt under the Sunni banner of the Abbasid Caliphate. The opportunity arose when into his court came the ousted vizier of that land, a man named Shawar, who requested Nur-ud-Din's help in overcoming his rivals in Egypt. He knew he could expect no help from the Shiite Caliph of Egypt, Al-Adid, and so help from Damascus was his only hope. In return, he pledged loyalty to Nur-ud-Din and the Caliph in Baghdad. After making istikhara, a special prayer where one seeks God's guidance, Nur-ud-Din dispatched his most trusted advisor, General Sherko, to march on Egypt. Sherko was a man marked with military genius and was well loved by his men. The general soon enlisted his nephew, a young man in his late 20s, who reflected on the task before him. His name was Saladin.
My uncle Sherko turned to me and said, "Yusuf, pack your bags, we are going." When I heard this order, I felt as if my heart had been pierced by a dagger. And I answered, "In Allah's name, even if I were granted the entire kingdom of Egypt, I would not go."
Such was young Saladin's shock at the enormity of the task that now lay before him and his uncle. His trepidation was well justified, as the courts of Cairo were well known for their intrigue, conspiracies, and plotting. So it was incredible to think that one day he would be its absolute ruler, as he later lamented.
In the end, I did go with my uncle. He conquered Egypt, then died. Allah then placed in my hands the power that I never expected.
But that was not yet to come. After a spectacular bout of attacks and counterattacks, Sherku and his men finally conquered Egypt. On the 8th of January, 1169, he triumphantly entered Cairo. But just 3 months later, General Sherku was dead, a victim of inflammation of the throat. The sudden vacuum left had to be quickly filled in order to prevent other powerful would-be leaders from seizing control.
Upon the death of Sherku, the advisors of the Caliph al-Adid suggested that he name Yusuf the new vizier because he was the youngest and seemingly the most inexperienced and weakest of the emirs in the army, Ibn al-Athir.
Despite some opposition, Saladin was appointed vizier of Egypt, second only to al-Adid, and of course he kept his affiliation to his master Nuruddin in Damascus. For a man who had dreaded going to Egypt, the turn of events upon events made it clear to him that God had indeed bestowed upon him a divine purpose. All the power Saladin could now muster in his heart and his limbs were dedicated to his new role as vizier. Bringing the learned scholars of Quran and Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, into his company, Saladin sought to infuse his every action with the light of Islam. It is said he instructed one such teacher, or mujtahid, to write him a catechism of the tenets of Islamic belief for him to recite, memorize, and teach to his own children. Saladin loved to recite the Hadith, and his humble heart, full of compassion, moved him to tears upon hearing verses of the Quran recited. When Saladin's life expired and his soul passed into the realm of the unseen, it was said that he left only 47 drachmas behind, the result of his generous and giving nature. It was in his character to give away whole provinces to those who needed the land. His goodness to the poor and the needy marked him as a remarkable ruler, whose own treasurers had to hide reserved treasure away from him, for fear that he might give it away. Despite the lavish trappings of his position, he refused to live in the plush palaces reserved for rulers, but instead lived in a modest abode befitting the tradition of other such rightly guided and exalted rulers. The timid and reluctant officer had been replaced by a confident and passionate champion of Islam.
This Salah ad-Din, a man of humble antecedents and lowly station, now holds under his control all these kingdoms, for fortune has graciously smiled upon him. William of Tyre.
Saladin was quick to warm the people of Egypt to him by removing taxes and opening new schools, but was also determined to crush any plotting against him or his administration. Saladin now commanded enormous wealth, as Egypt was richer and of more worth than the whole of Nuruddin's kingdom, which included Mosul, Damascus, Beirut, and Aleppo. A fact that Nuruddin knew only too well. He feared that Saladin might use that wealth to forge his own independent kingdom. Although Saladin never denied allegiance to Nuruddin, it was clear from his actions as Lord of Egypt that he relied little on Nuruddin's help or counsel. One of their primary points of conflict was that Nuruddin was impatient for the abolition of the Ismaili Caliphate, an imposition that Saladin believed should be taken slowly and gradually for fear of inciting a civil uprising. He had already put down a rebellion in the army, so he was biding his time before taking any further measures that may seem provocative to the Egyptian population. Unhappy with Saladin's delayed compliance to his orders, Nur-ad-Din officially and directly ordered him to remove the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid. Above all else, Saladin was loyal to his leaders, and he began to make plans to dethrone Al-Adid. But after a long and drawn-out illness, the Egyptian Caliph Al-Adid died before he was removed. With his death, the sovereignty of Egypt fell squarely onto Saladin's shoulders. Now unrivaled master of Egypt, Saladin wielded more power than ever, and presented more of a threat to Nur-ad-Din than ever. The rift mounting between the two men continued for 2 years, until in 1173 the unseen hand that moulded Saladin's career struck again. Nur-ad-Din died at the age of 60. The death of Nur-ad-Din exposed Damascus to attacks from the neighbouring descendants of the Second Crusaders, the Franks as they were known. Nur-ad-Din's heir, the 10-year-old Al-Salih, was in no position to rally a unified force in its defence. Only one man was capable of holding the reins of power and rule.
We don't own the people like light and darkness. They rushed to us, both before and after we had entered the city, in joy of our coming rule.
This is how Saladin recalled his entry into Damascus after he and a small army marched across the deserts of Syria. He followed this up by taking the cities of Homs and Hama, which secured his power in Syria. Saladin openly declared that his reign in Damascus was only part of a larger jihad to ultimately retake Jerusalem from the Christian Franks. Those who opposed Saladin's taking of the Sultanate fled to Aleppo with Nur-ad-Din's son Al-Salih. They went a step further and called in the sect known as the Assassins to eliminate him. Saladin narrowly escaped 2 attempts on his life, and in retaliation marched to their fortress at Masyaf. But a few days after laying siege, Saladin's forces withdrew and returned to Damascus after Sinan, the leader of the assassins, promised that he would not attack Saladin again. In 1181, just 8 years after Nur-ad-Din's death, Al-Salih too passed away. A year later, Saladin took Aleppo, and news of his encroaching rule reached the Franks.
Fear took hold of our people on hearing this news. From the first, it had been apparent to us, if Saladin succeeded in adding Aleppo to his kingdom, our territory would be completely surrounded by his forces. We'd be in a state of siege. William of Tyre.
For 20 years prior to his death, Nur-ad-Din had taught that a true Muslim should fight the Christian Crusaders who had taken Jerusalem. Saladin was now in the perfect position to do what Nur-ad-Din could not, to reconquer Jerusalem.
The opportunity now before us may never arise again. In my view, the Muslim army must confront all the infidels in an organized battle. We must throw ourselves resolutely into the jihad. When God gave me the land of Egypt, I was sure.
Taking Jerusalem.
The jihad and the suffering involved in it weighed heavily on his heart, his whole being and every limb. He would speak of nothing else.
The Christians were well aware that Saladin surrounded them on 3 sides. They waited in a state of anxiety, trying to guess where he would strike. The king of Jerusalem, King Baldwin, was a leper whose disease had forced him to place his brother-in-law, Guy de Lusignan, in command. It was Guy who was in charge when Saladin finally confronted the Frankish forces near the pools of Goliath. However, the Sultan's forces consisted of warriors who were not full-time professional soldiers, and so it was difficult for him to endure a sustained campaign. The Franks knew that all they had to do was avoid battle until Saladin's men became weary. The strategy worked, and Saladin and his forces withdrew to Damascus. In 1183, a rogue Frankish baron, Raynald of Chatillon, attacked the port serving Mecca in Arabia and took lives. Saladin quickly dispatched his brother, who successfully headed off the attack, bringing the perpetrators to justice.
Everyone was taken by surprise, for the people of these regions had never seen a Frank before, whether merchant or warrior, Ibn al-Athir.
Raynald of Chatillon, having escaped, some time later struck again, this time attacking a caravan on its way to Mecca. He killed pilgrims and took prisoners whom he treated with contempt.
He ill-treated and tortured the men and imprisoned them in narrow dungeons. When they invoked the truce, his only reply was, "Ask your Muhammad to save you." Bahadin ibn Shaddad.
When news of this reached Saladin, the Sultan vowed to kill Raynald of Chatillon with his own hands. After a few years of intermittent skirmishes, Saladin saw his chance to move against the Franks. In 1187, an immense force was gathered. The dust it raised darkened the very eye of the sun. Saladin took lead of the largest army he had ever assembled. This unrelenting hurricane was about to be engaged in the most decisive battle that ultimately would open the gates to Jerusalem. Coming out of Christian-held provinces, the Franks were convinced victory would be theirs, provided they fought with a substantial force. With this in mind, the Franks mustered all the manpower they could gather, leaving the Christian-held realm near defenseless. Saladin's strategy sought to weaken the enemy before engaging him in decisive battle. Hence his men picked off stray infantrymen and outriders as the Christian soldiers marched in the hot summer heat. Most importantly, Saladin instructed his men to block all routes to water available to the Franks. Dehydrated and weakened, the Franks marched on and continued to the twin hills located near Lake Tiberias and known as the Horns of Hattim. The Franks were horrified to find that their only place of hope, a well at the top of one of the hills of Hattim, had run completely dry. They now turned to the Lake of Tiberias far below them, but that too was blocked by Saladin's forces. Despite the fact that they were backed by the much-vaunted Knights Templars and the Knights Hospitallers, and that they marched with the cross of the crucifixion, it was obvious that Saladin's men had been successful in wearing down and driving the Franks into a state of exhaustion and fatigue. The situation looked dire for the Franks. Little did they know that things were about to get much worse. That night Saladin's men gave the Franks no rest and set fire to the bushes around their camp, wreaking havoc and confusion in their ranks. Imad-ud-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's aide, related the impending conflict with these powerful words.
Night separated the two sides and the cavalry barred both roads. Islam passed the night face to face with unbelief, monotheism at war with Trinitarianism. The way of righteousness looked down upon error. Faith opposed polytheism. Meanwhile, the several circles of hell prepared themselves, and the several ranks of heaven congratulated themselves. Malik, the guardian of hell, waited, and Ridwan, the guardian of paradise, rejoiced.
By the following morning, the Christian army, badly dehydrated and in near disarray, was driven into a crazed and riotous mob. Below them, they could see the Lake of Tiberias, but Saladin's forces still barred their way to it. One of the Christian leaders, Count Raymond, in a state of desperation, charged with his infantry towards the cool waters below. Their charge went unchallenged until the foot soldiers were separated from the mounted knights. Dramatically, in a vice-like maneuver, Saladin's forces came in between the two and swooped down on the now divided force with the aid of a wall of fire that kept the Christian horsemen at bay. The Franks had made a gross miscalculation. Their entire fighting force had been deployed in a confident attempt to eliminate the Muslims, but instead they were in turn destroyed on the horns of Hattin. A Knight Templar records in the history book known as the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi.
When the noise of battle had ceased and Saladin beheld the captives being dragged away, he raised his eyes to heaven and thanked God for the victory. One of his most frequent remarks was that our wickedness, not his power, gave him this victory. On this occasion, we were not with the Lord, nor he with us, and our troops were utterly worsted. This fateful battle was fought on this day, the 4th of July, 1187. In that short space of time, all the glory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was shattered and destroyed.
The Battle of Hattin proved to be a decisive turning point. With the once powerful Christian army now scattered and broken, many of the eminent leaders were captured, including King Guy and Reynaud de Chatillon, the man Saladin vowed to kill with his own hands. Now brought to Saladin's tent, the king was allowed to quench his thirst, but not so Reynaud. Instead, Saladin himself struck the executioner's blow that repaid him for his heinous crimes. Islam's bitterest enemies, the Templars and Hospitallers, also met the same fate. Sultan Saladin's army now faced a mostly defenseless, but nevertheless well-fortified realm. The cities of Acre, Galilee, Jaffa, and Beirut all fell before his unchallenged might.
When by Allah's help, not a single Frank is left on this coast, I mean to divide my territories and charge my successors with my last commands. Then, having taken leave of them, I will sail on this sea to its islands in pursuit of them, until there shall not remain on the face of this earth one unbeliever in Allah, or I will die in the attempt.
Eventually, they reached their prize, Jerusalem. After a 13-day siege, the gates were opened on the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's Miraj, or night ascension to heaven. Unlike the Second Crusaders, Saladin retook Jerusalem without a massacre, and instead showed great humility and fairness.
The Muslims took possession of the city on Friday the 2nd of October 1187 at precisely the time when the noon Friday prayer was due. The period for the obligatory prayer was almost over, making its performance impossible since they were unable to comply with certain of the Friday preparations.
Thus was the account given by Imad ad-Din concerning the taking of Jerusalem. And the Sultan, how did he experience the conquest? Imad ad-Din again gave the account.
His bearing was one of humility and somber dignity, surrounded by pious scholars and jurists. His face was bright with joy, and his hopes were crowned with the glory of success. The Quran reciters sat reading and repeating sections from the book. Poets sat reciting their verses.
Back in Rome, Pope Urban III fell down dead. Such was his distress at the news of Jerusalem's fall.
Sword of compassion.
Glory to Allah, who has bestowed this victory upon Islam and who has returned the city to the fold after a century of perdition. Honor this army, which Allah has chosen to complete the reconquest. And may salvation be upon you, Salah bin Yusuf, son of Ayub, you who have restored the spurned dignity of this nation. The address of Imam Muhi al-Din ibn al-Zaki.
Goodness, mercy, and light had returned to the streets of Jerusalem. Christians, who were the native inhabitants of Jerusalem, were allowed to remain in the city, but the troublesome and warring Crusaders were expelled. During their stay, Al-Aqsa Mosque was used as a central headquarters by the Knights Templars, who utilized part of it as a storeroom and toilet. A great golden crucifix was erected on the dome of the rock, a sight which greatly offended the Muslim soldiers, who quickly removed it. Inside, the rock, from which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had started his miraculous night journey to the heavens, had been covered by a marble slab. As was the custom during periods of conquest, Saladin agreed to terms of ransom for any individual who could pay for their freedom. Men would be ransomed at 10 dinars, women at 5, and children at 1. Thousands who could not afford the ransom were nonetheless freed by the Sultan and his men, who not only cared for them, but fed them. Such examples of mercy and generosity again showed Islam's high regard for human life. The same could not be said for individuals such as the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who paid his 10 dinars, then selfishly loaded a cart with a mass of treasures and left Jerusalem. Other Christians were less greedy and paid for the ransom of thousands to be freed. Much of the money collected as ransom was in turn given away to the needy. Saladin then released all old people, all captive husbands of freed wives, and gave gifts to widows and orphans. Such wonderful deeds prompted admiration for the Sultan, such as William of Tyre's comment.
He was the man, wise in counsel, valiant in war, and generous beyond measure.
Jerusalem was again opened to people of all faiths, and, as in the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, Islam reigned supreme. A third crusade was launched by the Christians, but they never succeeded in recapturing Jerusalem, in spite of the assistance of the famed Richard the Lionheart. Saladin soon after retired to Damascus, where he tended to the affairs of state. On the 21st of February 1193, the Sultan came down with a fever. His condition grew steadily worse over the next few days. News spread throughout the city that the shadow of death was upon his face. There was great weeping that accompanied a sorrow few had ever known before. As Bahar-Din ibn Shaddad said,
I had often heard people say they would lay down their own lives for that of someone very dear to them. I thought it was only a manner of speaking, but I swear before Allah that had we asked on that day who will redeem the Sultan's life, there were many of us who would have replied by offering his own.
Imam Abu Ja'far, a renowned teacher at the time, was summoned an hour after the Fajr morning prayer to the bedside of the Sultan, and it was while he was reciting the Quranic words, "There is no God but He, in whom do I trust," that Saladin smiled, his face grew radiant, and he passed away. Ahuddin ibn Shaddad comments,
The castle, the city, the whole world were thereby plunged into grief, of which Allah alone could fathom the intensity.
Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un.
so was the passing of Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a truly extraordinary man who exemplified the best qualities of leadership, unsurpassed in his courage, generosity, love for learning and piety. We must never forget how he struggled in his private and political moments to please Allah, the Most High. A man who, it was said, never missed his prayers except during his time of illness, who spent many hours supplicating his Lord late into the night. Whenever dark times fill us with fear and dread, whenever all hope seems lost, let us turn to our Lord in hope, knowing that, like Muslim legends such as Salahuddin, individuals strong in faith and steadfast in their deen can indeed change the world.
Muslim Legends Volume 1 Salah ad-Din was an Islamia media production, copyright 2001. It was written and produced by Khaleel Muhammad and narrated by Gai Eton. Additional voices were provided by Abdul Razak Goodall, Jalal Hartley, and Nazar Z. Mustafa.
Thank you for supporting our efforts by purchasing only genuine products. To find out more about our selection of Islamic products, please visit our website at www.mountainoflight.com. Alternatively, you may write to us at Mountain of Light, P.O. Box 7040, London N7 8JQ, or phone us on 020-7700-7586. In North America, please call 1-800-713-405-6800. In South Africa, call 011-4740-545. Also available from Mountain of Light, Islamia Media and Jamul Records. The life of the last prophet.
Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the last prophet, was born in the harsh desert land of Arabia.
The 30th juz of the Holy Quran, with English translation read by Yusuf Islam and Quranic recitation by Sheikh Muhammad Al-Minyawi.
By the heaven and At-Tariq, the night comer.
A is for Allah,
As for Allah, nothing but
Allah is the proper name for God, the Lord of the universe. He was not born and has no child, so we cannot compare him.
Prayers of the last Prophet.
On the coming of dawn, the Prophet ﷺ used to say in his prayers,
اللهم اجعل في قلبي نورا وفي بصري نورا.
Puji Pujian, Shukur, Senyum by Rayhan. The best of Rayhan. Bismillah. In praise of the last Prophet by Yusuf, Islam and Friends. Towards the Light by Zain Bika.
Praise him all day for what is and what was. Take hold of your iman, don't give in to shaitan. Oh, you who believe, please give thanks.
Children of Heaven by Zain Bika.
It's a way of life for all. It is taught in the Quran for big and small.